Rain hammered the streets of Chicago like tiny needles falling from the sky. People rushed past each other under umbrellas, faces buried in phones, shoulders hunched against the cold wind. Nobody noticed the old beggar sitting near the subway entrance with soaked clothes and trembling hands. Nobody except Emily Carter. 22 years old. Working 2 jobs. Barely surviving. And still somehow finding kindness in a world that had given her very little. Emily adjusted the worn backpack hanging from her shoulder as she stepped out of Rosie's diner at nearly midnight. Her feet ached from standing for 14 hours straight. The tips of her fingers were red from washing dishes after her evening shift. Inside her backpack sat the only food she had saved all day. A turkey sandwich wrapped carefully in napkins. Tomorrow's lunch. Maybe tomorrow's dinner too. Her landlord had slipped another eviction notice under her apartment door that morning. 3 months behind on rent. Her mother's medical bills stacked like mountains on the kitchen table. Every dollar Emily earned disappeared before she could even touch it. Still. When she saw the old man shivering in the rain beside the subway stairs, she stopped walking. Most people didn't. Some glanced at him with annoyance. Others pretended not to see him at all. The old man lowered his head as another group passed by laughing. His beard was gray and uneven. His coat looked older than Emily herself. Water dripped from his sleeves as he quietly held a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything helps." Emily stared for a moment. Then she slowly unzipped her backpack. "Excuse me, sir." The old man looked up with tired eyes. "Yes." Her stomach growled loudly the moment she pulled out the sandwich. For half a second, she hesitated. Not because she didn't want to help him. Because she genuinely didn't know how she would eat tomorrow. Then she smiled softly and handed him the sandwich anyway. "It's not much," she whispered. "But it's fresh." The old man blinked in surprise. "You're giving me your dinner?" Emily shrugged. "My mom always said nobody should sleep hungry if you can help it." The man stared at her carefully. Almost too carefully. As if studying something deeper than her words. "You look hungry yourself," he said quietly. Emily laughed softly. "I'll survive." But she didn't know if that was true anymore. The old man slowly accepted the sandwich with shaking hands. "Thank you," he said. No one had spoken to him with kindness all day. Maybe all week. Emily crouched slightly beside him despite the pouring rain. "You should get somewhere warm tonight," she said. "There's a church shelter 3 blocks from here. They usually open extra beds when it storms. You know the city well. You learn quickly when life gets difficult." There was no bitterness in her voice. Only exhaustion. The old man noticed that immediately. Most people complained when life became unfair. Emily simply kept going. "You remind me of someone," he murmured. Emily smiled faintly. "I hope that's a good thing." "It's the best thing." For the first time in years, the old man felt something unexpected stir inside him. Hope. Because the truth was, this wasn't really a homeless beggar. This was Richard Harrison. Founder of Harrison Technologies. One of the richest men in America. Worth over $4 billion. But after losing his wife 2 years earlier, Richard became disgusted with the fake people surrounding him. Business partners only cared about money. Socialites cared about status. Even some family members treated kindness like weakness. So he disappeared. Not permanently. Just long enough to discover whether genuine compassion still existed in the world. For 6 months, Richard had wandered cities disguised as a homeless man. Thousands walked past him every day. Very few stopped. And almost nobody gave without expecting recognition. Until Emily. A girl who had almost nothing. Yet gave everything she could. As Emily stood to leave, the wind whipped her thin jacket violently. "You should keep your food," Richard said suddenly. "Really?" Emily shook her head. "No. You need it more." Then she started walking away into the rain. Richard watched her disappear beneath the flickering streetlights. Something about her stayed with him. The way she smiled despite obvious pain. The way she gave without hesitation. The way she treated a stranger like a human being when everyone else walked by. And for the first time since his wife died, Richard felt his heart come alive again. But neither of them knew this simple act of kindness was about to change both their lives forever. Before we continue with this incredible journey, I spent countless hours researching and crafting this story to bring you something truly meaningful. If stories like this touch your heart and you want to see more acts of kindness that restore faith in humanity, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It means the world to me and helps these important stories reach others who need to hear them. Now, let's see what happens next. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that completely changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments below. The next evening, Emily almost didn't stop. Her body felt heavier than usual as she walked home from Rosie's diner carrying another leftover sandwich wrapped in foil. The freezing wind bit through her jacket, and her mind replayed the landlord's warning from earlier that morning. Friday, Emily. That's the final extension. 3 days. That was all she had left before losing the tiny apartment she shared with her sick mother. She tightened her grip on the backpack straps and hurried toward the subway station. Then she saw him again. The old beggar sat in the same spot beneath the flickering street lamp. Only this time, he looked worse. Much worse. His hands trembled violently, and his face had turned pale beneath the rain-soaked beard. A few teenagers walked past laughing while one tossed a crumpled soda cup near his feet. Emily stopped instantly. "Hey!" she shouted at them. The teenagers glanced back. "What? You dropped something." The boys rolled their eyes and walked away muttering insults under their breath. Emily sighed before kneeling beside the old man. "Sir. Are you okay?" Richard slowly looked up. Even pretending to be homeless, he hadn't expected someone to defend him. Especially not her. "I'm all right," he whispered weakly. "You're freezing." "I've survived worse." Emily frowned. "That's not an answer." She carefully sat beside him despite the dirty sidewalk. Cars splashed water across the street while cold winds swirled around them. "You didn't go to the shelter?" Richard hesitated. "I didn't want to take a bed from someone who needed it more." Emily stared at him. Then she laughed softly in disbelief. "That sounds exactly like something my mom would say." Richard studied her face carefully. Dark circles under her eyes. Cracked fingertips. Exhaustion hidden beneath forced optimism. And still, kindness. It made no sense to him. Most wealthy people he knew wouldn't inconvenience themselves for 5 seconds to help another human being. Yet this struggling girl kept showing compassion she could barely afford. Emily opened her backpack again. "No," Richard said immediately. "You already helped me yesterday. And you're still hungry today. So are you." Emily smiled faintly. "Then I guess we have something in common." Instead of handing him the sandwich this time, she split it in half. "One condition," she said. "What condition?" "You eat with me." Richard blinked. Nobody had shared a meal with him in months. Not like this. Not without cameras, business agendas, or fake smiles attached. He slowly accepted half the sandwich. "Thank you." Emily shrugged casually. "It tastes less depressing when someone else complains about it too." Richard laughed. A real laugh. The first genuine laugh he'd had in years. For a moment, he almost forgot the disguise. Forgot the billions. Forgot the loneliness waiting for him inside empty penthouses and corporate meetings. Here on this cold sidewalk, eating cheap diner sandwiches beside a struggling waitress. He felt human again. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily." "That means hard-working. You looked that up." "My wife used to love names." The moment the words left his mouth, silence settled between them. Emily noticed the sadness immediately. "You miss her?" Richard nodded slowly. "Every day." "What was she like?" Richard stared at the city lights reflecting in puddles. "She believed kindness was the most valuable thing a person could own." Emily smiled gently. "She sounds smart." She was. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Emily quietly admitted something she rarely told anyone. "My dad used to say the same thing before he passed away." Richard turned toward her. "You lost your father?" "When I was 16. "I'm sorry." Emily nodded softly. "After that, my mom got sick. I had to quit college and start working full-time." Richard frowned. "You gave up your education?" "Family comes first." She said it so naturally. As if sacrifice wasn't sacrifice at all. Richard suddenly felt ashamed. He had spent years surrounded by people obsessed with gaining more. Emily had lost everything and still focused on others. "You know," Richard said carefully, "most people would become bitter after all that." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe. But bitterness doesn't feed anybody." That sentence hit Richard harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. Because she meant it. Completely. Suddenly, headlights flashed across the street as a black luxury SUV slowed near the sidewalk. Emily noticed instantly. 3 men inside the vehicle stared toward Richard. Security. His private security team. Richard subtly shook his head. "Go." The SUV immediately drove away. But Emily caught the strange interaction. "You know them?" Richard answered too quickly. "No." Her eyes narrowed slightly. For the first time, suspicion flickered across her face. Richard felt tension rise immediately. Had he ruined everything? But before Emily could ask another question, a loud cough suddenly escaped Richard's chest. Violent. Painful. Emily's expression changed instantly from suspicion to concern. "You're sick." "It's nothing." "No, it's not." She stood quickly. "Come on." "Where?" "My apartment." Richard froze. "What? You can't stay out here like this." "I don't want to impose." Emily almost laughed. "You think my apartment has anything worth imposing on?" "Emily. My mom would kill me if she found out I left someone freezing outside." Richard stared at her speechlessly. This girl had overdue rent notices. Barely enough food. No stability. And she was still inviting a homeless stranger into her home. It was the kind of compassion money could never buy. As Emily helped him stand, Richard realized something profound. He had started this journey searching for good people. But he never expected one struggling waitress to completely change his understanding of humanity. And neither of them realized. The biggest secret was still waiting to be revealed. Emily's apartment was smaller than Richard imagined. One tiny living room. A worn couch with patched fabric. A kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand inside comfortably. But somehow, it felt warmer than the $20 million mansion waiting for him across the city. The moment Emily opened the door, the smell of homemade soup drifted through the room. A frail woman sitting beneath a blanket on the couch looked up in surprise. "Emily? Who's this?" Emily smiled gently. "Mom, this is, actually, I never got your name." Richard hesitated for half a second. "Henry," he said finally. The fake name came naturally now. "Well, Henry looks like he's freezing to death," Emily's mother replied immediately. "Get him inside." Richard stepped into the apartment slowly. The walls were cracked. The furniture mismatched. A tiny heater rattled noisily near the window. Yet there were framed family photos everywhere. Smiles. Birthdays. Love. Things money couldn't manufacture. Emily's mother extended her hand kindly. "I'm Margaret." Richard shook it carefully. "You raised an extraordinary daughter." Margaret smiled knowingly. "She gets that from her father." Emily rolled her eyes playfully while hanging up her wet jacket. "Mom says that every time I do something remotely decent. Because it's true." Richard quietly observed their interaction. There was struggle here. Pain too. But also loyalty. The kind he hadn't seen in years. Emily disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with steaming soup in chipped bowls. "It's simple," she apologized. "Mostly potatoes." Richard accepted the bowl carefully. "You didn't have to do this." Emily shrugged. "People need people." Again. Another sentence that sounded simple but carried enormous weight. As they ate together, conversation slowly became easier. Margaret told stories about Emily working part-time jobs since high school. About staying up all night helping neighbors with groceries. About secretly paying utility bills for elderly tenants in their building even when she barely had enough herself. Richard listened carefully. The more he learned about Emily, the more unsettled he became. Because none of it was performative. She wasn't kind for praise. She wasn't generous for attention. She simply believed helping others mattered. And that belief survived despite everything life had thrown at her. Later that evening, while Margaret slept on the couch, Emily quietly washed dishes beside the sink. Richard approached carefully. "You shouldn't trust strangers so easily." Emily kept scrubbing quietly. "Maybe. You brought a homeless man into your home. You don't feel dangerous." Richard almost smiled. "You're very confident about that." Emily finally looked at him. "No. I'm just good at reading people." For a moment, Richard wondered what would happen if she discovered the truth. Would she feel betrayed? Humiliated? Angry? The thought bothered him more than expected. Then Emily suddenly spoke again. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "You don't talk like someone who's been homeless long." Richard's chest tightened instantly. "I've had unusual circumstances. That black SUV yesterday wasn't usual either." Richard looked away. Emily dried her hands slowly. "I'm not asking for your secrets," she said softly. "Everybody has things they're ashamed of." The words hit Richard unexpectedly hard. Ashamed. Was that what he felt? Maybe. Ashamed that billions of dollars couldn't protect him from loneliness. Ashamed that he needed to disguise himself as homeless just to discover genuine human connection. Before he could answer, loud knocking suddenly rattled the apartment door. Emily froze immediately. Another knock came. Harder this time. "Emily Carter," a man shouted from outside. "Open the door." Fear flashed across Emily's face. Richard noticed instantly. "Who is that?" Emily swallowed nervously. "My landlord." The knocking grew louder. Margaret stirred awake anxiously on the couch. "Emily." Richard watched the young woman take a deep breath before opening the door slightly. A large man in an expensive coat stood outside with folded arms. "You got my notices?" "Yes, Mr. Jenkins. I just need more time." "You've had more time." "I'm trying." "No," he snapped coldly. "You're failing." Richard's jaw tightened. Several neighbors quietly peeked through their doors as the landlord continued loudly. "You owe 3 months of rent. I can't run a charity." Emily lowered her eyes. "Please. My mother's treatments. Not my problem." Richard stepped closer instinctively. But Emily subtly shook her head. Don't. She didn't want pity. Even now. Especially not now. Mr. Jenkins noticed Richard standing behind her and scoffed. So now you're bringing homeless people into the building too? Emily's face burned with embarrassment. He's a guest. He's a liability. Richard could see humiliation spreading across her expression. Not for herself. For him. That realization hit deeply. Emily wasn't ashamed of being poor. She was ashamed someone else was being insulted because of her. You have 72 hours, Jenkins warned. After that, you're out. The door slammed shut. Silence filled the apartment. Margaret quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Emily forced a smile immediately. It's okay, she whispered. I'll figure something out. But Richard saw the truth. She was terrified. And for the first time in years, Richard Harrison felt something stronger than curiosity. Protectiveness. He watched Emily pretend to stay strong while secretly trembling inside. And suddenly, pretending to be a helpless beggar no longer felt harmless. Because this wasn't just an experiment anymore. This was someone's real life. And if he kept hiding the truth much longer, he risked losing the one genuine person who had restored his faith in humanity. Richard barely slept that night. From the old armchair near the window, he watched the tiny apartment in silence while rain tapped softly against the glass. Margaret coughed quietly in her sleep. Emily sat at the kitchen table surrounded by overdue bills, calculator in hand, trying desperately to make impossible numbers work. Every few minutes, she rubbed her tired eyes and forced herself to keep going. Richard had negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He had built companies from nothing. He had solved crises that shook entire industries. But watching one exhausted girl silently battle poverty at 3 a.m. felt heavier than all of it. Because unlike business, this pain was personal. Finally, Emily noticed him awake. You should get some rest, she whispered. So should you. Emily laughed weakly. Sleep doesn't magically pay rent. Richard stood slowly and approached the table. How much do you owe? Emily immediately shook her head. No. You didn't even tell me the amount. I'm not taking money from you. Richard stared at her in disbelief. You let me into your home. That's different. How? Because kindness shouldn't come with debt. The sentence stunned him. Most people spent their lives taking. Emily refused even when she desperately needed help. Richard lowered himself into the chair across from her. What if someone genuinely wants to help? Emily looked down at the bills quietly. Then they should help someone who deserves it more. Richard almost smiled sadly. If only she knew. The next morning, Emily left early for work while Richard stayed behind with Margaret. For the first time in months, he removed the worn homeless coat and sat quietly beside the elderly woman drinking tea. Margaret studied him carefully. You're not who you pretend to be, are you? Richard nearly froze. What makes you say that? You carry yourself like a man used to being listened to. He gave a soft laugh. You're very observant. I'm a mother. We notice everything. For several moments, silence lingered between them. Then Margaret spoke gently. Whatever your secret is. Emily saw something good in you. Richard looked toward the door Emily had walked through earlier. She sees good in everybody. That's her blessing. And her weakness. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. The word hung heavily in the air. Because both of them knew the truth. The world often punished kind people first. Hours later, Richard stood outside Rosie's diner watching through the window. Emily moved quickly between tables carrying trays, smiling politely despite obvious exhaustion. Then Richard saw something that made his chest tighten. A businessman in an expensive suit grabbed Emily's wrist aggressively after she accidentally spilled coffee near his table. Maybe if girls like you spent less time daydreaming and more time working, you wouldn't be broke, the man sneered loudly. Several customers laughed uncomfortably. Emily apologized immediately. "I'm sorry, sir." But the man kept humiliating her. Richard felt anger rise sharply inside him. Not the controlled anger of boardrooms. Something deeper. Protective. Raw. Before he could stop himself, Richard entered the diner. "Take your hand off her." The businessman looked up in disgust. "And who are you supposed to be?" Someone asking politely. The man scoffed. "You homeless too?" Emily's eyes widened in panic. "Henry, it's okay." "No," Richard said firmly. "It's not." The businessman stood aggressively. "What are you going to do about it?" For one dangerous second, Richard Harrison almost revealed exactly who he was. The billionaire. The powerful CEO. The man capable of destroying careers with one phone call. But then he looked at Emily. And stopped himself. Because this wasn't about power. It was about dignity. Richard calmly stepped between Emily and the customer. "She made a mistake," he said quietly. "That doesn't give you the right to treat her like she's worthless." The diner fell silent. Even the businessmen seemed surprised by the calm authority in Richard's voice. Finally, the man grabbed his coat angrily. "This place is pathetic." Then he stormed out. Emily stared at Richard speechlessly. "Why would you do that?" "Because nobody defended you." "I'm used to it." Richard's expression softened immediately. "That's the saddest thing you've said since I met you." Emily looked away quickly, blinking back emotion. That night, everything changed. When Emily returned home, she found several eviction boxes stacked outside the apartment. Her heart dropped instantly. No, 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 no. She rushed upstairs. Mr. Jenkins stood inside the apartment changing the locks while Margaret cried quietly nearby. "You said 72 hours. I changed my mind." "That's illegal." "Take me to court," he replied coldly. Emily's breathing became shaky. "Please, my mother has nowhere to go." Should have thought about that before falling behind. Richard stepped into the hallway behind her. And this time, something inside him snapped. He slowly removed the old beanie from his head. Then the fake glasses. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Cancel tomorrow's board meeting," he said calmly. Mr. Jenkins frowned. "What?" Richard's voice turned ice cold. "And contact Harrison Legal immediately." The landlord's face slowly changed. Confusion. Recognition. Fear. Because suddenly, he recognized the man standing before him. Richard Harrison. Billionaire founder of Harrison Technologies. One of the most powerful men in the country. Mr. Jenkins went pale instantly. Wait. Emily stared at Richard in complete shock. The hallway became silent. Her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. The homeless beggar. Henry. Was actually. "No," she whispered. Richard turned toward her slowly. And for the first time since they met, he finally told her the truth. "My name is Richard Harrison." Tears filled Emily's eyes immediately. Not because he was rich. Because she realized the man she trusted had lied to her all along. And in that moment, Richard understood that revealing the truth might save her home. But it could also cost him the one human connection that truly mattered. Emily couldn't breathe. The hallway around her blurred as the truth crashed into her all at once. Richard Harrison. The billionaire whose face appeared in magazines. On television. On buildings across the city. The man standing in front of her wasn't homeless. He had never been homeless. And suddenly every conversation, every moment, every memory replayed differently in her mind. The soup at the kitchen table. The shared sandwich. The stories. The kindness. The lies. "You lied to me," she whispered. Richard didn't defend himself. Because he knew she was right. "I did." Emily stepped back slowly, hurt flooding her expression. "Why?" Richard looked at her with more honesty than he had shown anyone in years. "Because I needed to know if kindness still existed when money wasn't involved." Emily shook her head in disbelief. "So this was some kind of experiment?" "No. It sounds exactly like one." Mr. Jenkins stood frozen awkwardly nearby, too terrified to interrupt. Richard ignored him completely. "When my wife died," he said quietly, "I realized most people around me only cared about what I could give them. I didn't know who was genuine anymore." Emily crossed her arms tightly. "So you pretended to be poor?" "I pretended to disappear." "And you thought that gave you the right to test people?" Richard lowered his eyes. "No. But meeting you changed me in ways I never expected." Emily wanted to stay angry. She should have stayed angry. But then she remembered the cold sidewalk. The trembling hands. The sadness in his eyes when he spoke about his wife. Some of it had been real. Maybe all of it except the poverty itself. Margaret slowly stepped forward. "Emily," she said softly. "Look at me." Emily turned reluctantly. "That man may have hidden his name," Margaret continued, "but kindness recognizes kindness. You saw something good in him before you knew he was rich." Silence filled the hallway. Finally, Richard turned toward Mr. Jenkins. "How much does she owe?" The landlord swallowed hard. $3,800. Richard reached into his coat pocket calmly. "No," Emily interrupted immediately. Both men looked at her. "You don't get to solve everything with money." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right." Emily blinked, surprised by the response. "But you and your mother deserve safety," he continued gently. "Not because I pity you. Because good people shouldn't lose their home while people with power stand by doing nothing." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Margaret quietly took Emily's hand. "Sweetheart, sometimes accepting help is its own kind of strength." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Years of struggling alone had taught her survival. But not trust. Slowly, painfully, she looked back at Richard. "What happens now?" Richard gave a small smile. "That depends entirely on you." 3 months later, life looked completely different. The eviction notices were gone. Margaret was receiving proper medical treatment from specialists Richard personally arranged. Emily had returned to college part-time to finish the education she sacrificed years earlier. But the biggest surprise of all. She refused almost every luxury Richard offered. No expensive apartment. No designer clothes. No unlimited credit cards. Instead, Emily accepted something much smaller. Opportunity. Richard admired that deeply. One afternoon, he visited a newly opened community center on the south side of Chicago. Children laughed inside classrooms. Families lined up at the food pantry. Single mothers attended free job training workshops. Above the entrance hung a simple sign. The Carter Hope Center. Richard smiled as he walked inside. Emily stood near the reception desk helping a nervous teenage girl fill out scholarship paperwork. "You don't need to be embarrassed," Emily told her gently. "Everyone needs help sometimes." The girl wiped her eyes. "Thank you." Richard watched quietly from a distance. Then Emily noticed him and smiled. A real smile this time. Not guarded. Not uncertain. Just warm. "You're late," she teased. "I own the building." And somehow you're still late. Richard laughed softly. The employees nearby exchanged confused glances. Most of them still couldn't believe the billionaire founder visited almost every day personally. But Richard never cared about titles anymore. Not after Emily reminded him what actually mattered. Later that evening, they stood outside the center watching families leave with groceries and donated winter coats. You know, Richard said thoughtfully, this all started with a sandwich. Emily smiled. You looked hungry. I was. She looked at him carefully. Still are. Richard glanced toward the families inside the center. For the first time in years, no. Across the street, an elderly homeless man sat beside a bus stop holding a cardboard sign. Without hesitation, Emily walked over carrying 2 hot meals from the center kitchen. But this time, she wasn't alone. Richard walked beside her. The old man looked up nervously. Emily knelt beside him with the same gentle smile she had shown months earlier. Hi, she said softly. You look cold. Richard watched her hand the man warm food and a blanket. And suddenly the entire journey came full circle. A poor girl once helped a stranger because she believed kindness mattered. Now that same kindness had spread outward, touching hundreds of lives. Maybe thousands someday. Because compassion works that way. One small act becomes another. Then another. Until entire lives change forever. Stories like this remind us that extraordinary kindness exists all around us. If this touched your heart, please like this video, it helps more people discover these inspiring stories. Subscribe for more tales of human kindness that will restore your faith in humanity. And most importantly, look for opportunities in your own life to be someone's unexpected blessing. What act of kindness will you perform this week? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. And remember, you have the power to change someone's entire world.